Do you take this woman
An
to
old
be your
rancher fell in
lawfully wedded
love with a
wife,
quiet
for
woman,
richer or
not
poorer,
knowing who she used to be.
and in health?
A Montana saloon, 1885. The air is thick with stale cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the murmur of desperate men. Golden hour sunlight cuts through dust motes. Put a bride's name on this paper, Elias, or the territory reclaims your ranch by Friday. Magistrate Higgins tapped a stained marriage certificate against the splintered table. The law says a man needs a family to hold that much acreage. Elias did not flinch. 50, his face carved with harsh lines like a dry riverbed, eyes the color of cold iron. Keep your shirt on, Higgins. The evening stagecoach just pulled in. The swinging doors groaned open, letting in a desert gust. The bar's chatter died down. Mary stepped through the haze. 25. Wearing a travel-worn dress, her dark eyes carried a dangerous stillness. She walked straight to Elias's table and took the empty chair across from him. Elias leaned forward, his voice a gravelly rumble. You understand the arrangement? This isn't a romance. You get a roof, a bed, and my name. I keep my land. You ask no questions about my past. I ask none about yours. Deal? Mary did not blink. Where do I sign? Before handing over the pen, Elias reached into his weathered vest. He pulled out a tarnished silver pocket watch. Click. He flipped the metal cover open. Mary reached for the pen, but her fingers froze. Her eyes locked onto the watch. A jagged dent marred its left side. The saloon's ambient noise instantly dropped out. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears. Gunfire. Burning pine. A man in a deputy's coat holding that exact watch as her father bled out on the floorboards. 15 years she hunted the ghost who slaughtered the Miller family. Now, he sat across from her, offering his name. Is there a problem? Elias asked, his steel eyes narrowing. Mary took a deliberate breath. The terrifying coldness returned. Her hand flawlessly steady, she signed the paper. None at all, she murmured smoothly, just admiring the silver. The Elias Ranch, midnight. A desolate wind howls, violently rattling the window panes. The kitchen drowned in darkness, save for a single sputtering oil lantern. Mary stood in the center of the amber glow. From the empty hallway, a massive grandfather clock kept time. Tick. Mary held a heavy crystal glass filled with Elias's bourbon. From her dress pocket, she retrieved a dark glass vial. She popped the cork. Her pulse was dead calm. Tock. She tilted the vial. One clear drop of pure arsenic plunged into the whiskey. Tick. A second drop followed, dissolving into the alcohol without a trace. Heavy boots thudding against the floorboards broke the rhythm. Elias appeared in the doorway, his broad silhouette blocking the pale moonlight. He looked at her standing in the dark, misreading her silence for bridal apprehension. I do not need a lover, girl, Elias stated, his hard voice echoing off bare walls. I need a shadow to keep this house from rotting. Mary slowly turned. Her face was a perfect, unreadable mask of wifely submission. She stepped toward him, skirts whispering against the floor, and offered the poisoned glass to the man who ruined her life. I am very good at being a shadow, Mr. Elias. 3 weeks bled into 4. Inside the ranch house, the silence was a living, breathing thing. The long oak dining table felt less like a place to share a meal and more like a silent battlefield. Every evening, the ritual was precisely the same. The quiet clinking of porcelain, the scrape of silverware. When the grandfather clock chimed 9, Mary played the dutiful wife. She brought his evening bourbon, 2 drops of clear liquid, never 3, lest the bitter taste give her away, never 1, lest his judgment day be delayed. Elias sits at the head of the oak table. He does not look like the terrifying outlaw from her nightmares tonight. His skin is a sickly, ashen gray. A deep, rattling cough tears through his chest, echoing off the bare walls. He grips the table's edge, his knuckles turning white, fighting a wave of violent nausea. Mary sets the glass down. Her face is a blank, obedient mask. "Your evening drink, Elias." He doesn't look up. His massive, calloused hand reaches for the glass. It trembles. The ice clinks sharply against the crystal. He downs it in one swallow, unknowingly drinking his own death. Mary watches his throat work, feeling a cold, detached satisfaction. The monster is breaking. The front porch, sun-baked and choked with red dust. Mary stands inside the parlor, hidden behind yellowed lace curtains. Outside, the heat is suffocating. Elias sits heavily on the wooden porch steps. An orphan boy from the neighboring farm squats in the dirt nearby, watching with wide, expectant eyes. Mary narrows her eyes, focusing entirely on Elias's hands. The hands that held her father's silver watch are now shaking uncontrollably. The poison is ravaging his nerves. He can barely hold the small whittling knife. Sweat beads on Elias's forehead. He takes a jagged breath, forcing failing muscles to lock. With agonizing, deliberate patience, he carves the final curve of a wooden horse's mane. He gently tosses the toy to the boy. "Go on now," Elias grunts, his voice raspy and exhausted. The boy beams, clutching the horse, and runs off into the dust. Behind the glass, Mary's breath catches. She steps back into the shadows. Why is the devil carving toys for orphans? It is a jagged crack in the monstrous portrait she has painted of him. The ranch study. Past midnight, the sharp bite of a dying cigar fills the air. Mary steps into the dimly lit study. Elias sits slumped in a high-backed leather armchair, staring blankly into the dying fireplace embers. The orange light dances across eyes, hollowed out by a crushing, profound remorse. On the desk beside him lies the open ranch ledger. Mary walks closer. She glances at the ink. A massive sum of money has been quietly crossed out. "I saw the bank draft," Mary says. Her voice slices through the heavy silence. "You paid off the town blacksmith's debt, all of it, anonymously." Elias takes a slow, shaky drag from his cigar. He doesn't look at her. "A man in your position should let people know when he plays savior," Mary presses, testing the waters. "Why hide it?" The thick smoke drifts upwards. Elias finally turns his head. The firelight catches his tired, iron eyes. He looks right through her, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounds like a confession to the empty room. Because this land has already drunk enough blood from poor men. Elias leans his head back against the leather chair, closing his eyes. His chest heaves with another suppressed cough. Sometimes, Mary, a sinner just needs to throw his money away to buy the illusion of peace. Late afternoon. A violent dust storm obliterates the sun, the wind screaming through wooden slats. Inside the stable, the air is thick with swirling dirt and the coppery scent of panicked horses. "Hold the line, damn it!" Elias roared over the wind, wrestling a terrified mare into her stall at the far end of the corridor. Opposite him, Mary threw her weight against the stallion's iron latch. Inside, the massive roan thrashed wildly, driven mad by the storm battering the tin roof. "Elias," Mary shouted, "the hinges are snapping. He's going to break through. Get away from the gate, now." Elias dropped the lead and sprinted down the aisle. It was too late. The wooden gate splintered with a deafening crack. The latch exploded outward. Heavy wood struck Mary's chest, violently throwing her backward. She scrambled, coughing blindly into the dust. Above her, the stallion reared, eyes flashing white with terror. Iron-shod hooves descended with lethal force, aimed directly at her skull. Mary threw her hands over her face. A massive silhouette burst through the dust. Elias threw his huge frame horizontally, tackling Mary out of the drop zone and driving her deep into the hay. Simultaneously, the hooves crashed down. A sickening crunch pierced the wind. The stallion's leg caught Elias squarely in the ribcage. He collapsed, a guttural groan tearing from his throat. Yet, even in blinding agony, his arm remained rigidly locked over Mary's head, shielding her until ranch hands rushed in to secure the beast. The storm violently pelts the window panes. By the trembling lamplight, Elias lay shirtless on the iron bed. His breathing was dangerously shallow, each breath a wet wheeze. A horrific, purple-black bruise spread across his right side, skin pulled taut over shattered bone. Mary stood by the bedside, wringing a damp linen rag. She poured a heavy measure of whiskey into a glass. "Drink this," she ordered, masking the tremor in her hands. "It will dull the pain before I set the binding." Elias cracked his bloodshot eyes open, slowly shaking his head. "Take it away. I need a clear head. The storm, the herd. The herd is secured. You have broken ribs," Mary snapped. "Drink it." I said no. He ground out through clenched teeth. "Just wrap the damn chest." She swallowed hard, setting the glass down. For the first time, she willingly touched the bare skin of the man who slaughtered her family. His flesh burned with fever. Beneath her fingertips, she felt the brutal map of his past, pale bullet holes, jagged scars. It was not the impenetrable armor of a monster, but the failing skin of a broken man. Her hands, the same hands that flawlessly measured arsenic every night, shook violently as she wrapped clean bandages around his torso. Elias flinched, a hiss escaping his pale lips. His trembling hand weakly wrapped around her wrist, stopping her from pulling the linen too hard. Mary froze, refusing to look at his face. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me," she whispered defensively, pulling free. "I am only a contract, a signature on paper." Elias turned his head. His iron eyes found hers, stripped of their usual coldness, leaving only desperate exhaustion. "A man must protect what lives under his roof, Mary," he gasped, his eyelids fluttering shut as another wave of pain hit. "Even if it costs him his final breath." Silence swallowed the room as he slipped into unconsciousness. Mary stood frozen. Down the hall, the grandfather clock chimed. Tick, tock. Her right hand drifted to her apron pocket, fingers brushing the cold glass of the arsenic vial. She pulled it out, holding it up to the lamplight. She stared at the poison, then at the man breathing raggedly on the bed. The monster who murdered her family. The old man who carved a wooden horse for an orphan. The husband who threw himself beneath iron hooves to save a wife he didn't love. The violent conflict suffocated her. A single tear broke free, tracing a hot line down her dusty cheek. Her knuckles turned white around the glass. She squeezed her eyes shut. Slowly, agonizingly, her grip loosened. She lowered her hand, sliding the vial back into her apron. Tonight, the devil would live. The impenetrable, icy wall of her hatred had finally sustained its first massive fracture. The Elias Ranch, front gate, high noon. The sun is a blistering white hole, baking the earth. Heat waves distort the horizon. The air is stifling, heavy with tension. Sunlight glints off the steel barrels of Winchester rifles. 5 riders materialized from the shimmering heat. They halted just beyond the ranch's wooden gate, red dust settling around them like a dirty shroud. Elias stepped onto the porch. He moved stiffly, breathing shallowly to protect his shattered ribs, but his massive frame still blocked the doorway. Mary stood a few paces behind in the cool shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. The leader, a man with a jagged scar across his jaw, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Vance. 15 years ago, he was the man who kicked the lantern into the Miller family barn. Hot day to be wearing a heavy conscience, Elias, Vance called out. His greasy drawl made Mary's stomach turn. Elias rested his hand inches from the Colt, 45 at his thigh. You're trespassing, Vance. State your business and ride out. Business is bad, old friend, Vance sneered, resting his repeater across his saddle horn. The law is breathing down our necks. We need a stake to get across the border. $5,000 should do it. Consider it a late fee for old times. For that messy business, 15 years back. In the shadows, Mary's breath hitched. Messy business. Her hands curled into trembling fists. Vance's predatory eyes shifted past Elias, piercing the gloom. A filthy grin stretched across his scarred face. Well now, look what the devil dragged in. Didn't peg you for the domestic type. If you ain't got the cash, maybe we'll take the girl. She'd fetch a fair price down south. We'll burn this shack to the ground and call it square. The click of 4 rifle hammers echoed like firecrackers in the dead silence. Elias did not flinch. He reached back, shoving Mary behind his broad back, shielding her entirely with his body. Then he moved. It was a blinding blur. Despite his broken ribs, Elias drew with the lightning speed of a seasoned killer. Bang! The gunshot shattered the air. A cloud of white smoke erupted from Elias's barrel. Vance flinched as the .45 caliber bullet tore through the crown of his hat, ripping it off and sending it tumbling into the dust. Vance's horse screamed, dancing backward. The other 4 riders froze, fingers hesitating on triggers. Elias stood perfectly still, the smoking barrel aimed directly between Vance's eyes. Vance swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his cheek. He forced a trembling sneer. "You've gone soft, Elias," he spat. "A woman is going to dig your grave for you." Elias pulled the hammer back. Click! The metallic sound cut through the ringing silence. His voice was a low earthquake of menace. "I buried the Elias of 15 years ago, along with your victims," Elias growled, his iron eyes boring into Vance's soul. "The man standing before you now is just a ghost protecting his own grave." The standoff stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. Finally, Vance yanked his reins, his face pale. "This ain't over, old man," Vance hissed. "Let's ride." The gang spurred their horses, galloping back into the heat waves. Elias didn't lower his gun until the dust swallowed them. Behind him, Mary stared at the broad expanse of his back, the reality finally setting in. Elias wasn't just a monster. He was the only thing keeping the real monsters at bay. The master bedroom, midnight. A torrential downpour lashes violently against the glass window panes, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown by a furious wind. The room is suffocatingly dark, illuminated only by a single, flickering oil lamp and the harsh, intermittent strobe of lightning. A deafening crack of thunder shook the floorboards. Then a heavy, sickening thud echoed over the roar of the rain. Mary sprinted toward the door. Elias lay crumpled on the hardwood floor just outside the bedroom, his massive frame convulsed violently. A dark, horrifying pool of crimson spread from his lips, soaking deep into the wood. He choked, coughing up thick blood. The weeks of carefully administered arsenic had finally overwhelmed his iron constitution, combining lethally with the shock of his shattered ribs. "Elias," Mary dropped to her knees, frantically grasping his broad shoulders. His skin was scorching, radiating an unnatural, terrifying heat. He didn't register her presence. His iron eyes were rolled completely back, trapped entirely in the inescapable nightmare of a decade and a half ago. Mary dragged his seizing body toward the iron bed. Her boots slipped repeatedly on the bloody floorboards. She strained every muscle, finally managing to heave his upper torso onto the mattress. The rain battered the windows in a relentless drumbeat. She grabbed a linen towel, pressing it firmly to his bleeding mouth. "Stay with me," she ordered, her voice trembling wildly. "Elias, look at me." But Elias violently thrashed, throwing his massive hands up to cover his face as if shielding his eyes from a blinding explosion. A guttural, agonizing scream ripped from his bleeding throat. "No!" Elias roared at the empty air, his voice breaking into a desperate sob. "Don't light it. Vance, drop the lantern. There are people inside." Mary froze. The wet towel slipped from her trembling fingers. Elias convulsed, his hands clawing desperately at his own chest. "It's too dark in there," he gasped, pleading with a ghost. "The sheriff. He has the badge. He put the gun right to my head. He made me pull the trigger." Another jagged cough racked his frame, spraying crimson across the white sheets. He grabbed Mary's wrist with a crushing, feverish grip, staring at a towering shadow in the burning barn of his memory. "I didn't know they were in there," Elias wept. The invincible man was crying like a helpless child. "I didn't know there was a family hiding in the straw. The badge made me shoot into the dark, and then Vance through the fire." Lightning flashed, violently illuminating Mary's horrified face. Her breath stopped entirely. Elias's grip on her wrist tightened, his wide eyes suffocating in an ocean of guilt. "That little girl, I saw her crawling from the flames. I couldn't save them. God, I'm sorry. I hunted them down. I hunted Vance's men for 15 years, to pay for it, I swear." His eyes rolled back, and his heavy arm went completely limp, dropping off the edge of the bed. The truth hit Mary with the crushing force of a derailed train. She stumbled backward, gasping for air as the room spun wildly. He didn't order the massacre. He was a rookie deputy, forced at gunpoint by a corrupt sheriff to shoot into the dark, and for 15 years he hadn't been running from justice. He had been delivering it. He had spent his entire life hunting down the men who murdered her family. And she had spent the last month methodically murdering him. "No," Mary whispered, her whole body shaking violently. "No, no, no." She plunged her hand into her apron pocket and pulled out the dark glass vial of arsenic, the poison she had so carefully measured, the righteous vengeance she had been so proud of. With a raw, agonizing sob, Mary hurled the vial across the room. It shattered violently against the stone fireplace, the remaining poison sizzling harmlessly into the cold ashes. She threw herself over Elias's motionless chest, her hands desperately gripping the collar of his sweat-soaked shirt. "You are not allowed to die," Mary screamed over the thunder, tears streaming down her face, pressing her ear to his fading heartbeat. "Do you hear me? I haven't given you permission to die." She scrambled off the bed, kicking aside the broken glass. She ripped open her trunk, tearing frantically through her belongings, until she found her canvas pouch of medicinal herbs, milk thistle, activated charcoal, and yarrow. She had brought them to mask the symptoms of his poisoning, but now they were the only things that could reverse it. She rushed back to the bedside, mixing the crude antidote with trembling, desperate hands. Tonight, the Grim Reaper had come to collect on her contract, but Mary was going to fight him for every single breath. The violent storm has reduced to a miserable, weeping drizzle. The room is suffocatingly dark, reeking of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and damp, rotting wood. Mary tore through the study, like a desperate mad woman. Her hands were stained with black charcoal and Elias's blood. She violently ripped open the heavy drawers of his oak desk, hurling ledgers, inkwells, and loose papers onto the floor. "Where is it?" she muttered frantically, her breath ragged. "Laudanum, morphine, something." She yanked the bottom right drawer with such aggressive force that it completely slipped off its wooden tracks, crashing heavily onto her boots. As it fell, the thick mahogany base of the desk groaned. A concealed wooden panel, previously hidden securely behind the drawer, slid slightly ajar. Mary froze. The frantic beating of her heart echoed in her ears. She dropped to her knees, staring into the dark cavity. Her trembling fingers reached into the hollow space. There was a heavy iron lockbox. It was fastened with a rusted brass padlock. Desperate, Mary grabbed a heavy iron letter opener from the floor and violently jammed it into the hasp. She wrenched it downward with all her remaining strength. With a sharp snap, the brittle brass gave way. Mary threw the heavy lid open. Inside, there was no medicine. Resting on top was a thick sheet of legal parchment, sealed with dark red wax. Mary picked it up, unfolding it with shaking hands. She held it up to the pale moonlight, filtering through the rain-streaked window. It was a last will and testament. She checked the date at the top. It was drafted on the exact same day she had arrived on the stagecoach. Her eyes darted across the heavy black ink. "Being of sound mind, I hereby leave my entire estate, all monetary assets, and the deed to this land, to its rightful owner." The name written boldly on the dotted line below was not Mary Elias. It was Mary Miller. A choked, horrifying gasp escaped her throat. The heavy parchment slipped from her fingers, drifting silently to the floorboards. He knew. He had known her true identity from the very first second she sat across from him in the dusty saloon. Her hands plunged frantically back into the iron box. She pulled out a worn, black velvet case. It felt terrifyingly heavy. She pried the velvet lid open, and her breathing completely stopped. Resting on the faded silk lining was a delicate pearl brooch. Beside it lay a silver-capped fountain pen. Mary let out a raw, agonizing sob, pressing her hand hard over her mouth to stifle the sound. They were her mother's brooch, her father's pen. The precious heirlooms that had been mercilessly looted from the ashes of her childhood home 15 years ago. Elias had spent his fortune quietly tracking them down in the black markets, buying them back one by one. And sitting right in the center of the velvet box was the tarnished silver pocket watch. Mary picked it up. The metal was freezing against her palm. She pressed the latch. Click. The cover popped open. There was no glass inside. There were no ticking hands to tell the time. Instead, carefully fitted into the circular casing, was a tiny, faded pencil sketch of a man, a woman, and a little girl standing in front of a wooden barn. It was a crude, desperate drawing of the Miller family, kept close to his chest for a decade and a half. The devastating, earth-shattering truth crashed down upon her. Every single night, when the grandfather clock chimed 9, when she handed him the crystal glass of bourbon, he tasted it. He knew exactly what she was feeding him. He drank the poison not because he was a fool, but because it was her hand offering it. Mary's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the cold, hard floor of the study, clutching the silver watch violently to her chest as if it were a dying bird. Tears streamed down her face in a relentless, blinding flood. "He knew," Mary whispered to the empty, shadowed room, her voice completely breaking under the agonizing weight of his sacrifice. She curled into herself on the floorboards. "From the very beginning, he knew I was a bullet aimed straight at his heart, and he simply tore his own shirt open." The suffocating darkness is violently ripped apart by a blinding, roaring orange flash. The air instantly thickens with the choking stench of kerosene and burning pine. Red firelight dances wildly across the steel barrels of drawn rifles. Mary was still kneeling on the study floor when the first gunshot shattered the parlor window. Crack, crack, crack. Glass exploded into the room. A flaming torch tumbled through the broken frame, landing heavily on the Persian rug. The dry wool ignited instantly. "Vance," Mary gasped, terror instantly snapping her out of her grief. She shoved the silver pocket watch deep into her apron and sprinted down the hallway. Smoke was already billowing from the ceiling boards, thick and suffocating. She kicked open the master bedroom door. Elias was struggling to sit up on the edge of the bed. The fever and poison ravaged his system. He was coughing up dark blood into his hand. "Get up!" Mary screamed, throwing his heavy, burning arm over her shoulder. "They're burning the house down." With a sheer, agonizing act of will, Elias forced his legs to bear his massive weight. Together, they stumbled out the back door into the rear courtyard. The heat was blistering. The massive wooden barn was a towering inferno, sending millions of glowing embers raining down upon them like hellfire. Through the black smoke, the silhouettes of Vance's gang circled the front of the property, firing their Winchesters blindly into the burning house. "The back gate," Elias wheezed, blood trickling from his pale lips. "The stallion." They dragged themselves to the rear corral. The roof of the stable was catching fire, but the massive roan stallion was still tied to the post, screaming in panic. Elias let go of Mary. Drawing upon some impossible, final reserve of adrenaline, he grabbed her firmly by the waist and violently heaved her up into the leather saddle. "Elias, get on!" Mary screamed, desperately reaching her hand down through the swirling ash. "Take my hand!" Elias didn't reach up. Instead, he took a step backward. He grabbed the heavy iron-barred gate of the corral and violently swung it shut between them. Clang! He pulled a heavy chain across the bars, snapped the brass padlock shut, and tossed the key directly into the roaring flames. "What are you doing?" Mary shrieked, her horse dancing erratically as the heat intensified. Elias pulled his Winchester rifle from a nearby scabbard. He turned back to her, leaning heavily against the iron bars. His massive frame was shaking, barely able to stand, illuminated by the apocalyptic glow of the inferno. He was locking himself inside the burning courtyard to become a human shield. Mary threw her upper body over the horse's neck, her bare hands desperately gripping the scorching iron bars of the gate. Tears carved clean lines down her soot-stained face. "Why did you let me do it?" she screamed, her voice tearing over the deafening roar of the fire. "I saw the watch in the study. Why did you drink that glass every single night?" Elias looked up at her. A stray bullet ricocheted off the stone wall mere inches from his head. He didn't flinch. Slowly, the harsh, rigid lines of his face softened. A sad, completely peaceful smile cracked through his grimaced, blood-stained features. He looked at her not as a victim, and not as a killer, but as a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very dark road. "Because Mary," Elias rasped softly. The crackling roar of the flames threatened to drown out his words, but she heard them echo in her very soul. "Every drop of poison from your hand tasted like forgiveness." He reached through the bars, his trembling, calloused fingers gently wiping a tear from her cheek. Then he pulled his hand away. Elias racked the heavy lever of his Winchester. Clack, clack. He turned his broad back to her, facing the wall of fire and the silhouettes of the approaching riders. With his free hand, he violently slapped the stallion's flank. "Ride!" he roared. The horse bolted into the dark, empty plains, carrying Mary away from the fire, the gunfire, and the only man she had ever truly loved. The desolate Montana plains, late afternoon. The sky is a bleeding canvas of deep crimson and violet. In the distance, the skeletal ruins of the Elias Ranch send thin ribbons of black smoke into the wind. Beneath the twisted branches of an ancient oak tree lies a freshly dug grave. The sheriff and his deputies moved slowly through the charred courtyard. The final standoff had been a slaughter. Vance and his entire gang lay dead in the ash, surrounded by spent brass casings. At the center of the carnage, they found Elias. His massive frame was riddled with bullets, his calloused hands still locked rigidly around the lever of his empty Winchester. He had dragged every last one of them to hell with him. A mile away from the smoking ruins, Mary stood alone under the great oak. She wore a high-collared mourning dress of stark black, the heavy fabric whipping violently in the desert wind. She stared down at the simple, unmarked wooden cross. For 15 agonizing years, this exact moment had been her only reason to draw breath. The monster was dead. The Miller family's stolen land was legally returned to her name. Her childhood vow was fulfilled. The scales of justice were finally balanced. But as she stood over the turned dirt, there was no triumph. There was no peace. There was only a suffocating, permanent void hollowing out her chest. She had spent a decade and a half hunting a demon, only to realize too late that she had poisoned her own guardian angel. The heavy crunch of boots on dry grass broke the silence. The sheriff walked slowly up the slight hill, pulling his sweat-stained hat from his head. He stopped a few paces behind her. "The wagons are loaded, Mrs. Elias," the sheriff said gently. "We're heading back to town. You shouldn't stay out here in the cold." Mary didn't turn around. Her right hand was clenched tightly against her stomach. Her thumb rubbed the cold, dented metal of the tarnished silver pocket watch. The sheriff sighed, stepping closer. He looked at her pale, tear-streaked face. "I know it's hard, ma'am. He left you with a terrible mess. But Elias was a violent, ruthless man. He had a lot of innocent blood on those hands, going way back. Don't cry for a bad man, ma'am. You still have to live." Mary stood perfectly still. The wind howled across the empty plains, carrying the bitter scent of pine ash. Slowly, she looked down at the grave. She clicked the pocket watch open, her thumb gently tracing the glassless face and the faded sketch of her family hidden inside. "He was a bad man," Mary whispered. Her voice was hollow, trembling with a grief that would never heal. She snapped the watch shut, clutching the silver tightly over her broken heart. "But he was the only good thing I ever had." The dust may settle over the Elias Ranch, but the echo of a silent sacrifice remains. In the Wild West, love isn't always about a happy ending. Sometimes it is the heavy price paid for a second chance at redemption. Mary walked away with the land, but she left her heart beneath that ancient oak tree. If this story touched your soul, don't let the trail end here. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more cinematic tales of passion, betrayal, and the ghosts of the frontier. Tell us in the comments, was Elias a monster or a man who simply loved too late? Until the next sunset, keep the fire burning. Subscribe now.